Uh, Thanks, Jane. So I'm Ingrid Tohver, Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington, and I wanted to use this presentation to sort of set up Jane and Rhonda after me in terms of giving the foundation, the data foundation for the projects that they were working on. So this is a project that we worked on with the Olympic National Forest and Park Service on how they can use hydrologic projections of extreme events for culvert design. And just to put us on the map, state of Washington, and the main question is how to incorporate these projections into infrastructure design, road infrastructure design, in this region of the Olympic Peninsula, which we will focus in here. The Olympic Peninsula is a rather large area, and the national forest, the forest is a larger area out here and incorporates about 2,200 miles that they have to maintain. And then the park is a smaller area within there, and they have about 140 miles that they have to maintain. And a lot of these have, there are numerous rivers on the Olympic Peninsula, and a lot of road crossing areas that they have to incorporate into their road designs. And you also have to think about aquatic habitat for salmon who are running up and down these rivers. So it's not a very simple problem. And so what I'm going to focus on here are the climate and hydrologic projections in this presentation. To give you some background, these are from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the most recent publication, 2013. These are their projections for carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere by the end of this century. And these solid lines are the new projections, which are called RCPs, which are representative concentration pathways. And then the dotted lines are the former projections that came out in 2007. So these are based on scenarios of carbon dioxide projections, but they're older scenarios. So the idea of this graphic is just to show you how comparable the newest projections, the RCPs, the solids, are to the dotted lines. All projections show an increase in carbon dioxide by the end of the century, and they're all pretty similar up until the mid-century, but you see a lot of divergence in the latter half of this century. And then I'd also like to point out that RCP 8.5 are the higher end projections, and then 2.6 is the lowest RCP, and pretty unlikely at this point. So, translating those carbon dioxide projections into temperatures for the end of the century, these lines show, this is a lot like what Phil Mote showed in his presentation this morning, and these show the envelope around these lines show all of those models, 39 models, projections, and then the mean is this solid line here, and this is for the RCP 8.5, and then this is RCP, this purple is 2.6, that lowest concentration pathway for 32 models, and then this is a historical. So you see again, they're pretty similar up until the mid-century, and then there's quite a bit of divergence of these projections. And on the higher end, this is in degrees Fahrenheit over here. On the higher end, we're looking at almost about a 10-degree Fahrenheit increase in global temperatures annually. And on the lower end of this highest RCP, we're looking at about 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, that's annual temperature increases, so how this plays out in terms of seasonal changes is very different. So you might think that 6 degrees is, we can handle that, but there's quite a bit of variability within these projections. And then this graph shows those same projections, but this is for the Pacific Northwest. So this shows RCP 8.5, that highest scenario, and then RCP 4.5, sort of a moderately low scenario. And then the background colors, these squiggly lines, are those 39, 32 models, and it shows a lot of the variability that you'll get over time. And then these are the averages. So in the Pacific Northwest, the moderate scenario shows about a 5-degree annual increase in temperature, and then the higher model shows about a 10-degree increase in annual temperature. And just to compare those RCPs to the former 2007 projections from the IPCC, this graphic shows, and the reason I'm showing you this is because our hydrologic projections that I'm going to show you for this presentation are based on the former 2007, these SRES scenarios. So I just want to show you that these have been updated, but they're also very similar. So the B1, which is a moderately low scenario, is very similar to RCP 4.5. And these show the 90th and the 10th percentiles, 25th and 75th percentiles. And then these dots are the individual model runs. So there's not too much difference in the projections from 2007 to 2013. But again, all models show an increase in temperature for the Pacific Northwest by the end of the century. And what that means in terms of hydrology, a big impact is we're going to have less snow, because if your temperatures go up, then less of your precipitation is going to accumulate as snowpack, and it'll fall as rain rather than snow. So these maps show the Columbia River Basin. This is Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and it shows the historical snowpack, where it accumulates. It's where you would imagine in the Cascades, the upper elevations, and in the Rockies. And here is the Olympic Peninsula, the case study for this particular presentation. For this whole region, by the 2020s, we're looking at a 19% decrease in snowpack. By the mid-century, about a 30% decrease. And by the 2080s, a little over 50% decrease in snowpack over this whole region. And the mid-elevation basins are the ones that are most sensitive to the increases in temperature, because any slight increase in temperature bumps up the freezing level. And I have a cartoon that'll illustrate that a little better. But essentially, you're getting less snow accumulation, and you're also going to have an earlier spring runoff, because snow is going to melt earlier. So these are the three typical basins that we find in the Pacific Northwest. You have a rain dominant. This is the Chehalis River in western Washington, and these are hydrographs that follow the water years, so from October to September. And essentially what you're seeing here is that the Chehalis is, most of its stream flow occurs when it's raining, because the basin is warm, so there isn't it doesn't have an upper elevation area where the snow can accumulate and then melt off later. So you get most of the stream flow coming down this basin when it's raining. Whereas the Yakima is what we consider a transient basin. It has enough of a snow melt component to create these stream flows later in the water year. So you get this small bump when it's raining, and then here you have snow accumulation in the upper elevations of that watershed, and then as those areas warm, you get snow melt runoff. Finally, the Columbia River is typical of a snow-dominant basin, and very little rain components early in the water year, and most, if not all, of the stream flow is occurring later in the water year when the snow melts. These maps show how those basins are distributed spatially across this region. This is a historical map, and this shows that these red basins are the transients. The blue are the snow dominants, so up in the British Columbia, where it's cold enough, and in the upper elevations of the Cascades, the Rockies, you have snowmelt dominant, and then along the coastal areas you have the rain dominant basins. And then these subsequent maps show us marching into the future how those that spatial distribution will change with time. So you get a retraction of the snow dominant and more of the transient basins into that area, and then an expansion of all these rain dominant basins. These again are based on A1B scenario. It's a moderate emission scenario for the future. And then there's a projected loss of snow dominant basins, complete loss of snow dominant basins, in the United States portion of the Columbia River Basin by the end of the century. Just to point out the Dungeness River, because this project is focused in on the Olympic Peninsula, I wanted to show you how its hydrograph might change. This is the historical hydrograph, so it's that classic transient basin behavior where you have the rain input, snow accumulation, and then runoff when that snow melt occurs. So this is a historical, and then marching into the future, the A1B scenario for 2020s, you see more contribution from the rain and less from snow, and an earlier spring runoff for the Dungeness River. And then the 2040s, that becomes more pronounced. And then by the 2080s, this looks a lot like the Chehalis hydrograph at this point, because it's mostly rain dominant. You have a little bit of snow left, but this is a very different stream flow behavior than the historical situation. So those are average flows. Those are stream flows that are averaged over a monthly time period. So for this project, the Olympic Park Service and National Forests were interested in extreme events because that's what really affects their culvert design. So looking at extreme events, we used this project that was done back in 2000. I think it was finished in 2010. It was run by Alan Hamlet at the Climate Impacts Group, and it takes these future climate projections, runs it through a hydrologic model, and then these dots are different routed stream flow points from this project. So at each point we have routed stream flow data for the historical and then for the future runs, for those 3 time periods that I showed you earlier. And these are the people who funded this project. And then we have all of these hydroclimate variables for each one of these dots on the map. And so this is a schematic of the hydrologic model that was used to create those data points for those routed flows. What the VIC model does is it separates the geography, the spatial area, into these grid cells. In this case, they're 1/16 degree, or about 11 square miles. And it resolves the water input-output for each grid cell, and then the routed flows are essentially you put the time component into it and route those flows to each one of those points on the map that I showed you earlier. So the temperature and precipitation come from the climate models. They're fed into this VIC hydrologic model, and this also has a snow component to it. So you have a very good sense of physically what is happening in the hydrology of these basins. So this map is from that same project. So each one of these dots show the routed stream flow. It's what these dots represent are the flood for the 100-year flood. So it's comparing the 21st century, the future to the past. So essentially where these dots get bigger and redder is where you are going to have larger magnitudes of the 100-year flood projected for these areas. And if you remember from the maps I showed you earlier, a lot of these dots are, the bigger, redder dots are occurring in those mid-elevation basins, those transient basins, the red on those maps that I showed you earlier, are the first to respond here in the 2020s. 2040s, it becomes more exacerbated. By the 2080s, you're looking at quite a bit of higher floods in the future for those transient basins. And the mechanism behind this is essentially, this is a schematic of a cool climate flood. So if you imagine your river basin is a book, essentially, and an open book, and so this is the, oops, sorry, spoiler alert. Essentially, this is your river basin here, and where this is the freezing level of that basin, and what's happening here at the higher elevation areas is their precipitation comes down, and it's cold enough in higher elevations to accumulate as snowpack, and then the lower elevations below the freezing point produces instantaneous runoff. So that's if you have a big event, a big rain event or precipitation event, then this part will create the flood. This contribution below the freezing level. However, if you warm up the climate, then that freezing level goes up in elevation, and essentially you have a much larger area of your basin contributing to flood flows. So you have a lower snowpack because this freezing level has essentially gone up. For the Dungeness River, from that same project, we estimated those flood flows, the magnitude for the 20-year, the 50-year, and the 100-year flood. And then these little red dots are each model run. So we ran 10 models. And so these are estimates of the increase of the 100-year flood by the 2040s for the Dungeness River. So this is a 20-year flood, sorry. But you see that each model shows a progression, shows an increase in the magnitude of that flood. And then the 100-year flood looks like this, where you have, this is a historical, this little blue one, and then each red dot is the future for this basin, the Dungeness River. So you see that all models are projecting an increase in the 100-year magnitude flood. However, this information is great, but if you think about the Dungeness River, the National Forest Service or Park Service, if they have a road going over it, this river is big enough that they're going to build a bridge. This river is too big for a culvert. So, up here in the headwaters, a smaller stream is what they're interested in for building culverts. But we don't have, this project doesn't have routed flows for these really small streams. So the Park Service and the Forest Service came up to us and they said, well, can you provide us with some projections for these smaller streams? And we scratched our heads and decided that yes, we can. And the way we did that was for this fine-scale hydrologic stream analysis. If you remember the hydrologic model that I showed you, that schematic of a grid cell, what we did is we essentially estimated the flood flow for each grid cell. So now we have estimates of how the flood might look like over the land at a much finer scale, which is much more useful information for culvert design, because you're going to build a culvert for a smaller stream, not for these large rivers where we have routed flows. So we estimated the 100-year flood and the low flows for this project, but I'm going to concentrate on the floods at each 16th degree grid cell by aggregating the base flow and runoff for each grid cell. So it gives you an idea of future, how the future magnitude of the flood might increase over each grid point for this study. So this is what it looks like. This is the Olympic Peninsula. This is the 2020s, 2040s, 2080s. Again, it's the ratio of the future to the historical flood. So where these areas get darker blue is where you're going to have higher magnitudes of the 100-year flood in the future. So you see the responses in these where the mountains are. And these are essentially your mid-elevation basins that are responding to increases in temperature. And we have information for each grid point cell, so that that's more useful for the road design and culvert design in the Olympic Peninsula. So you're looking at upwards of a twofold increase in the magnitude of the 100-year flood by the 2080s for some of these headwater areas in the Olympic Peninsula. And this is the same map, but we aggregated, they also wanted information based on the 12-digit HUCs. So we aggregated those grid cells to create this map of the 12-digit HUCs. Again, you see these mid-elevation areas responding most dramatically to the floods of the future. So this is the Olympic Peninsula 12-digit HUCs for the 2040s. And then I marked out two basins here because I wanted to show you the hypsometric curves for these two basins. And this basin here, you see a very little response. You see a 10 to 20% increase in the 100-year flood for the 2040s for this basin. And this is what it looks like, the hypsometric curve looks like. This is elevation versus a basin area that is essentially contributing to stream flow. So you see, this is a current rain on snow elevation here. So you see, if you bump up this rain on snow elevation, you don't get that much more contribution from that particular watershed. You get very little extra contribution by bumping that up because this is mostly a rain-dominant watershed here. But I'll also show you this Tunnel Creek here has a more significant contribution because much of its basin is above the rain on snow area. So if you were to bump up this this elevation of rain on snow, then you get a much larger contribution of the basin to flood flows in the future for Tunnel Creek. So this is a basin where the Olympic National Forest might consider looking at their roads and seeing if they need to prioritize maintenance of culverts in this watershed versus this watershed. And we applied that same analysis to the entire Pacific Northwest. This is a 12-digit HUC. It's a little washed out, but you get the idea. Again, you're seeing more dramatic increases in flood flows for the mid-elevation basins. This is for the 2080s under the A1B scenario, and in the Rockies here. So we're pretty confident that this analysis will hold true and can be used for road design in the future. And essentially, this is part of the tool that I wanted to point out that we also created. This is for each individual HUC. We have the information of the magnitude of the 100-year flood for each model run. That's up here. These are the model runs. And then the average of those runs for the 2020s, 2040s, and 2080s. So we have this information as well for each one of those HUCs that a manager can use, pull out the HUC that they're interested in, and see how sensitive it's going to be to future warming. So how the next steps, and Rhonda and Jane are going to talk about this, is how to incorporate these finer scale projections into tools that can be used for agencies. Jane is going to talk about culvert design and how the Department of Fish and Wildlife can use these fine-scale projections for their agency's culverts designs. And then Rhonda is going to talk about her project. This is a GIS tool. I think she's not concentrating on this, but this is what one of the tools that can come from this is. This gives you an idea. This is in the Upper Cascades, the North Cascades, and it gives you an idea of where these projections of flood in the future, where they intersect with roads. This is the Cascade River Road, and so it gives you an idea of where to prioritize the maintenance of your roads if if the floods are going to be greater in this grid cell versus this grid cell here, then you may prioritize maintenance in this grid cell or this one. So I'm going to hand it off to Rhonda, and she's going to talk about her project using these projections. Oh, or I could take questions as well. Yes.
So that is based on rain on snow events, right? But on areas that have most of their areas for rainfall events, and then projections of more intense rainfall events for climate change, 5 inches versus 13 inches in 24 hours, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. How does that relate to what?
These projections take into account most of the flood increases that we're seeing from these projections are due to temperature change, so an increase in temperature. These, the downscaling method used for these projections is called the hybrid delta method. It does not do a great job of capturing atmospheric rivers or these really big rain events, say. The precipitation projections, the projections do not really differ that much from natural variability in the future for the hybrid delta downscaling method. A better method of downscaling for that would be the transient or the dynamical downscaling, which we have some work done on that as well, but it's very computationally intensive, so we couldn't do all 10 runs and give the whole range of these model runs for this particular project. So it does not, these do not do a great job of capturing those huge rain events that we're going to get from atmospheric rivers. This is more of a sensitivity to temperature increases in the future. Yes?
I just wanted a clarification on one of your slides, the one that was just a couple back about, you had how much rainfall was going to be coming in the areas were going to be hotspots by 2080, and you had the darker blue in the Rocky Mountains and in the Olympics and stuff. But in the middle area, it said 0 then -60. So is that there's going to be more droughts and less water in that area?
So it's interesting how these pan out, but some of the projections show that you're actually going to get a decrease in the 100-year flood magnitude, and that's because in the very coldest basins, we are not getting the same temperature response to these projections in the future. So it actually shows that because there's for that reason, because you don't have as much snow accumulation, then you're not going to get the floods in those particular regions those watersheds. So it can show a decrease in the magnitude of flood because you do not get those. You don't have the same snow accumulation that you did historically. So those are areas that would flood much later in the year when you're getting a lot of snow melt. But if you don't have the snow accumulation for that melt, then the signal shows that you actually get a decrease in your floods.
I was just thinking that slide in itself tells a lot about where funds for salmon recovery should be spent.
Yeah, spatially, it's an interesting question where, you know, how spatially these extreme events are going to pan out over the landscape. Yes.
I work in the Upper Columbia, and I've kind of just done some really basic analyses looking at, you know, since climate change obviously is occurring on a continuum, I've been interested to see how, you know, certain basins have been responding so far, and can make a break in the data set anywhere to say there are some clear changes in these basins that have already been occurring. And particularly for basins that have otherwise really similar mean basin elevation, similar drainage areas, and similar origins, that is basically at the crest or very nearly on the crest, flowing east. And I've noticed there's some pretty big differences between watersheds, and it always, I never know quite what to make of it, but it seems to me like there's more there than simply elevation, and I can only suspect that there's stuff that has to do with soil types, bedrock geology, and vegetation. I'm curious if you guys, anybody in your group has thought or started to look at trying to incorporate some of those components into the models to make it more explicit.
So the VIC model is a great model. It's a physically based model, but it does not take into account changes in vegetation cover, and the soil layers don't go terribly deep. So you don't get a whole lot of the information from what's coming in through the soil. So a better model for that is called the DHSVM, Distributed Hydrologic Vegetation. Sorry, the acronyms always escape me when I try to pull them out. But that model does a much better job because it does incorporate the vegetation and deeper soil level layers. So there is work being done on it, but for this particular project, we were more interested in a broader view, and the VIC does a really good job of giving that sort of, 1,000-foot level. We were covering the whole Columbia Basin. So DHSVM is great, but it's, again, pretty intensive computationally, and so you have to run it over certain small basins at a time, and the calibration of it can be time intensive as well. So there are better models for this, but to get this entire region that we got with this project, I think VIC was the best way to go, and then probably look at these smaller basins using DHSVM as needed.
Thank you, Ingrid.
Sure. Did you have a question?
I did.
All right.
Do you have any of the flood estimates for the recent burn areas in Washington, like specific on the Culvert Indian Reservation?
Ooh, I don't know. I could, if you talk to me afterwards, I could look. I'll give you my card. Yeah.
The Okanagan Conservation District is really studying that right now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, talk to me afterwards, and I'll see what we can do in terms of data exchanges.
All right, thanks.